Hi, I'm Fred Hocker. I'm the Director of Research here at the Vasa Museum, an archaeologist and historian. I'm responsible for trying to learn everything we can about the Vasa find and all its details, and then to tell you about it. Since you can't come to the museum, we're reaching out to you this way. Today what I'd like to tell you about is the Kajüten, the Great Cabin, the Admirals Cabin. If you have been watching us up to now or you didn't get a chance to see my colleague Peter Rudebjörk yesterday tell you about the building, you can see the earlier films on Instagram TV for the Vasa Museum. And tomorrow, my colleague Christine Uttebori will be talking to you from the magazine where we store all the objects that were found on Vasa. But today, let's talk about the Kajüten, or the Great Cabin. We sometimes say the Admiral's Cabin, but really we should say the King's Cabin. What we're standing in is a replica that was constructed here in the museum to show people what this cabin was like. It's located on the upper gun deck, that is below the upper deck of the ship. And this is where, if the king were on board, he would have stayed. If the king wasn't on board, then this is where an admiral would stay. But legally, this room isn't really part of the ship. This is part of the royal palace. When you step through this door, you are leaving the ship and stepping into the royal palace. This is the seat of the king's power. This cabin is not just a cabin, it's also an embassy. It has a very specific and important ceremonial and legal function. An admiral is also a kind of an ambassador. And so this room is where he could negotiate a treaty, where foreign dignitaries would be received. And so it has to convey the power and the majesty of the state, even though it's in a confined space on board a ship. So you can see all of this rich decoration, all of these sculptures along the walls, all this fine paneling is all meant to create the impression that you are inside the royal palace. And in fact, this is a room within a room. The original or the structural part of the ship is almost completely hidden in here. We're not standing on the deck. This is a floor laid over the deck in very wide, fine pine boards like you'd find in a palace. You can see the same thing today if you go to Skokloster Palace, for example. They have this kind of floor. This is a completely separate layer of oak paneling on the walls, covering the ship's planking. And then in the ceiling, we don't have it in this reconstruction, but there was a false ceiling, a coffered ceiling, probably painted, that covered the area in between the beams. And in fact, even this thing that looks like a closet isn't really a closet. It just covers up the mizzen mast of the ship, which happens to stand in the room. But you can't have that seen because that would give it away that you're not inside the palace anymore. A lot of the material to use this is very, very high quality. The original boards in the floor are very wide, long, clear pine boards. I think I counted in the original floor there might be 8 knots. And that's very, very clear, expensive material that had to be very carefully sourced from the forest. The walls are even finer. This reconstruction, I have to admit, is made out of much lower quality material than the original. In the original, all of these panels are made out of perfectly straight-grained, radially converted timber, the most expensive way to convert a log into individual boards to give you the absolute best quality. And it would have had perfectly even, parallel pencil stripe grain, very stately, very elegant, giving you a sense of pondus and power. And that material is probably imported. Our dendrochronological analysis, that is, looking at the tree rings, suggests that material probably grew in the forests of what are now Poland and Lithuania. That's the same kind of material that was imported into Holland and sold to artists like Rembrandt in order to paint portraits on, because it's very, very stable. And it has that very even grain, means that you can rely on it not changing shape as the temperature and the humidity change. The people who made this interior are probably not the shipwrights or the joiners at the Navy Yard. We think there's a very good chance that this interior was made by the king's carpenters, sent down from the royal palace to make this, because this is an extension of the palace. As a result, this is the only surviving royal interior from Gustav Adolf's reign in Sweden. We think that's pretty cool, but it also tells you how important this room was. If the king is bothering to personally see to the outfitting of this room, it means that the room is important. It has to embody his power. And it does that not just through all of these decorations. It uses the shape of the ship very effectively. If I'm a visitor coming in the door here, and the king or an admiral is receiving me, he would be standing about where the camera is. And because the ship gets narrower as you move aft, and I have to climb a hill, a slight slope, to get to the host, and the ceiling is getting slightly lower as I get here, what that's doing is it's creating a false perspective. When I come in the door, it makes this room look longer than it really is. And it makes whoever is standing here look taller than he really is. It establishes the power relationship when you come into the room right away, so that the person receiving you is clearly in the dominant position. One of the fun things I've been able to do when we do state visits or VIP visits, because we don't normally take visitors on board the ship couldn't take it. But if the King of Sweden wants to bring a guest on board, well, he can bring a guest on board. And in those cases, what we have asked him to do is we've asked His Majesty to stand in the place where Gustav Adolf would have stood to demonstrate the effect. And I'm fairly sure that the king doesn't mind looking like he's 1.85 meters tall. In addition to that ceremonial role, this room had another function, because the sleeping and living accommodations in the ship are really very limited. Almost all of the crew slept together on the deck in the gun decks. Even the lower ranking officers slept with the crew. It's not like an English or a French ship that would have a lot of small cabins for all the officers. There's a cabin just above this one that we think is where the captain and the 2 lieutenants that the ship had might have lived. But virtually everyone else is in the main gun deck space. But the king or the admiral, if he was on board, had to live somewhere. And so this is also the living accommodation for the highest ranking people on the ship. But it's carefully hidden. You stow it away when you're not actually using it. This bench here that runs along the side is actually 2 double beds. That there's a fold-out bed on each side. Now that looks like about a big single bed for us, but you could put 2 people in here, probably sleeping with their heads at opposite ends. So you have the other person's smelly feet in your face. And there's a total of 4 of those, so you could sleep up to 8 people in this cabin. That gives you an idea of what the accommodation was like, because even if you're the king, you have to share a bedroom. You might even have to share a bed, although I'm reasonably sure the king gets his own mattress. Fold it up. Don't even have to make the bed. Just fold it away and it disappears. We've also got a table here. This is a reproduction of a table that was found in the ship. We're cheating a little bit because this table doesn't belong to this cabin. This table actually was found in the cabin above. This is the captain's dining table, not the admiral's. And there are a couple of ways we can tell that, not just of where it was found. For one thing, it's made out of pine. All of this interior is oak. Oak is the noble wood. Pine is the everyday wood for normal people. We can also see it's fairly simple in its design, that it's a plain top. It's a very simple base that comes apart. The whole table knocks down into 4 pieces, which you would have to because we figured out if you put it together, you can't get it through the door into the cabin up above. So it's a traveling table in that regard. But it's big enough to seat 6 people around it. It's a very sturdy design, very attractive. We have a good story with it. The original used to be on display, and we had a visit from somebody who really liked that table a lot. And so he came back twice to measure it and disappeared under it with his tape measure and his notebook to get the measurements because he wanted to build a copy for his vacation house. His name is Jimmy Carter, by the way. So I wrote to him. He wrote back very kindly, but said he'd been busy with other things and hadn't had a chance to build the table yet. But he got his drawings out when I wrote, and so he discovered he was still missing 2 measurements. And if we could supply them, then he might get going on the table. So I haven't heard back since then. There must have been some way of eating here, because in the inquest, this room is mentioned. After the ship sank and all of the officers that survived were interviewed or put on trial, you might say, the admiral who was on board, Erik Jönsson, specifically said, for some reason, because no one asked him a question, but he said he'd only had a little bit to eat that day, that he had shared a little piece of meat with his servant in the cayutan. So there was somewhere to sit and eat something in this room on the day that the ship sank. It's just not this table, but they might have just had their plates in their laps, who knows. We do have some pewter plates that come from this area. For the last couple of years, we've had a very big project looking at all the remains of this interior, as well as all of the cabins. What we'd like to do is a new reconstruction of this space. We know that some of the details here are not exactly correct, that this molding and these heads shouldn't sit here, they should sit up underneath the overhead, for example. We know that this window, which is rectangular, is in fact not. It's got an arched head instead, and a few other small details like that. We also wanted to know what was the original color here. The exhibitions department thought it would be interesting to repaint the interior in its original color scheme to give people an idea of how that might have looked. And especially because the outside of the ship is so brightly colored. It was thought, well, maybe the interior must be similarly extravagant. And so one of our conservators at the time, Emma Hocker, spent 2 years looking at every single piece of sculpture that comes from the cabin under a microscope, and could not find a single instance of paint or gilding on anything from the interior of this space. This was probably varnished, maybe stained to enhance the contrast. But if we compare it to other very, very high quality interiors from the late 16th and early 17th centuries, such as the surviving interior from Kalmar Slott, there's a surviving interior of a chapel built by Gustav Adolf's grandfather in Germany at Schleswig. They're all varnished. That you wouldn't bother to spend all that money on that very, very expensive, very high quality oak if you were just going to paint over it. Pine, you paint. And so the upper cabin, we can see, is decorated in a simplified form of this same style. Slightly simpler moldings, slightly coarser overall, because you can't put quite the same level of detail in it. And that interior probably was painted rather than varnished. So that's what this space was used for. We would like one day perhaps to try to reconstruct the original interior as an exhibit that people could see. We'll see if that ever happens as an exhibition program. It's one of the things we're talking about. I hope you'll come back to us tomorrow at 1628 when my colleague Christine Uteborg will talk to you from the magazines where we store the objects that were recovered with the ship.